you go. Right. So this is, for the sake of the record, for the recording, this is Sunday, June 14th, our fourth session of Celtic Christianity. And yeah, you were asking about the cover. So last week we were talking about Iona and St. Columba, how he started the monastery in Iona. If you remember, he was exiled from Ireland because of a family feud, became one of these wandering Celtic saints, ended up on this island in western Scotland, Iona, built monasteries there and churches, and Iona ended up becoming a center for Scotland of education, culture, and Christianity. It became really a focal point for spirituality for Scotland, and much of Scotland, or pretty much all of Scotland, was converted from the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, Picts, who were pagans, converted to Christianity because of St. Columba and his monks. So it turned out being exiled from Ireland was good for Scotland. And it was a cultural and spiritual center of Scotland for centuries, like about 400 to 500 years, until finally the Vikings destroyed it. But one of the things that came out of Iona was these illuminated texts. And they are so-called illuminated because they were embossed with gold and silver, and the texts were just as much about the artwork as the words themselves. They were usually gospels or other sections of the Bible or liturgies that were written as illuminated texts. And many of them were lost or destroyed, especially because of Viking raids, but we still have samples of them in museums. And this one is called the Book of Kells. And it's so named because it was found in the monastery of Kells. They think it was brought there in the year 806 because of Viking raids, which was really just a few years after it was written. So it was written and drawn on Iona about 800 AD. And 6 years later is brought to the mainland for protection. It is an illuminated manuscript of the four Gospels. It's currently housed at the Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. There are many illuminated manuscripts produced in Western Europe from around 500 to 1600 AD. And it's thought to be a showpiece for the altar more than for daily use because of all the attention given to the artwork. So yeah, Vikings first struck Iona in 795, shortly after their raid on Lindisfarne Priory in Britain. And Priory is a monastery or a convent. There was a Viking raid in 806 that killed 68 monks at Iona. And eventually they abandoned the abbey shortly after that. Here's another picture from the book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? The detail and ornate designs. And I can imagine, this is 1,000 years old or more, how much it's faded. I can't imagine what it looked like when it was brand new.
Yeah.
There's another picture from that book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's such detail in the lettering. It's a unique art form of its own, for sure. There's another page. Hard to even make out the letters. You just sit there and stare at the artwork.
Yeah.
And here's another illuminated manuscript called the Stowe Missal. And you see it even has its own special box designed just for the book itself. And it's called the Stowe Missal because it was from a library at Stowe House, owned by the Duke of Buckingham. And there's the calligraphy writing from the book. It was written both in Latin and Irish. So the writings in the missal itself are a combination of Latin and Irish. dates to about 750, although the mass that's in the volume is probably 6th century. There's a liturgy in the Stowe Missal that is the only surviving example of the liturgy for Celtic rites from before the Great Schism. There's other missals that are known from the era with Celtic rites and Galician and Roman liturgy rites, which is interesting too, is when we talk about the history of the church on the British Isles or the Celtic Church, there's so much back and forth of influence from Rome or versus the independence of the Celtic Christianity that was there right from the beginning of time, right from the beginning of the Christian church. And you see that in these writings too. You see a mix. You see the Celtic rites. You see the Galician, which is a type of Celtic rite, and the Roman liturgy. The canon also contains a preface of Irish origin that's not known anywhere else. I found that interesting too. Just think about all the things that were lost too with all the Viking raids, destroyed and burned, and this book has, as you see, prayers and phrases from Coptic, Eastern Syrian, Ethiopian, Roman. So it contains really a mixture of all the Christianity from all the regions of the world at that time. So it's probably a earliest example of an ecumenical text. Really encompasses all of the different viewpoints and approaches to Christianity at that era. I find that fascinating too. How do they collect all that? How do they gather that?
Yeah, that's what I find amazing, that we have all this information from all over the Mediterranean and East and all the way to Britain.
Yeah. How did it all get there to these isolated islands off the coast of Scotland?
Yeah.
Somebody wrote them all down. I find that fascinating too.
You know, because travel wasn't easy, right. For sure.
Especially to a western remote island, you know, an island off of an island. Also interesting of note, in here they have the Nicene Creed. Are you all familiar with what's called the Filioque?
The what? Filioque?
This is a hot topic if you're gonna go to an Orthodox church and they want to debate with you about Eastern versus West. This is one of their hot topics, and to me it's minutia. So in the Nicene Creed, when you say the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, the original creed just said it proceeds from the Father. Filioque is Latin from and the Son. So the Filioque, the and the Son, was added in much later, centuries later, after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. They came out with this creed, right? And they came out with the creed to answer debate and heresies that were happening at the time. That's why we have the Nicene Creed, to codify certain basic beliefs that should be unified throughout Christianity, which is really the definition of Catholic. Catholic means we all agree on these set of things. So Catholic, when we say we believe in the Catholic Church, of course we're not saying Roman Catholic because we're not Roman Catholic, but Catholic in small c, the Catholic, and we are all in agreement on certain philosophical and theological principles. And that's why they came up with the Nicene Creed in 325 to say these other people who are preaching these heresies are wrong. These are the things we believe in. Well, the original creed had the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and it stopped there and moved on. And a few centuries later, there was a priest in Spain who added from the Father and the Son, and he was doing it to try to make some point. I don't remember what the point even was. And honestly, I don't know why it mattered. And when I was Orthodox, I'd listen to these lectures talking about this issue, explaining why it's so important. And I would listen to it and think, well, I still don't understand why it's important. I honestly think, in 1040 AD, when they were splitting, Rome and East were splitting, I honestly think the Eastern bishops were looking for another reason to be mad. And they were mad that they added the Filioque, because I don't really think it makes a huge philosophical or theological difference. I don't really understand what the difference is. Maybe I don't understand it, but I just don't see where it matters. But it is interesting historically to look at this Stowe Missal and see that the original creed didn't have the soliloquy, and later someone added in the margins, added in the soliloquy. So I think it's more of a historical interest than anything else. And here's some totally illegible Latin writing that I certainly cannot read. So it's believed to have been added. Oh, here comes somebody else, Bud and Jen. To the monastery of Laura in Ireland from 1050 onward, and was compiled at Tallaght in Dublin, Ireland. It is one of the extant manuscripts of a complete Western liturgy predating the Great Schism before the East and West split, when there was really just one church in the world. Technically speaking, all the Armenians had already kind of split off due to geographic isolation. But the Armenians split off earlier from geographic isolation, not from theological debate or disagreement.
Were most of the church documents written in Latin during this period? That was like a universal language?
Yes. Yeah, kind of, I would say for Western civilization and, well, I mean, Eastern civilization too, Eastern Europe, Middle East, yes, it would have been the most universal language for the church at least. Certainly they would have Greek and Hebrew and other local languages. You know, like we saw, some of those texts were also written in the Gaelic Irish of the time. But the most universal language would have been Latin, and we would have had many texts in Latin, especially missals and liturgies and so forth. At least at this era. All right, so those are things coming out of Iona, and I had mentioned before. So the golden age of Celtic Christianity, which was about from 400 to 800 AD, roughly. There were three major saints, most important saints that came out of that era. One was Saint Columba, which we talked about all last week. Saint Patrick, of course. Everybody in the world knows Saint Patrick, even if you don't know anything about Christianity, you've heard of Saint Patrick. And then Saint Bridget, which would be the third most significant saint from that era and that location. And we'll talk about her next. Now, I'm assuming everybody here knows all about Saint Patrick. That he was born in Britain. He lived from 386 to 461, and at the age of 16, he was kidnapped. There were raiders from northern Scotland, Picts. The Picts would come down and sweep off the coast and raid and pillage, kind of like Vikings, and they would capture young men and sell them into slavery. So Patrick was sold into slavery in Ireland and was there for, I think, 6 years. And eventually he escaped. He was sold into slavery in Dalriada, Ireland. By the way, Ireland at that time was known as Hibernia, which means the land of winter. I don't know about you, but I've heard of the word Hibernia before, like in Irish recipes and so forth. You hear the phrase Hibernia. So that's the old word for Ireland.
I lived in a little village in New Jersey called Hibernia.
Did you really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. It means land of winter.
But the thing is, all the people that lived there were Norwegians.
Oh, were they really? Yeah. Yeah. It was probably Irish to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So he escaped after 6 years and returned home. And when he returned home, his mission was to become a priest, to go back to Ireland and convert the pagans to Christianity. So I don't know about you, but it sounds a little bit like maybe a Stockholm syndrome. But but that became his mission in life, and exactly what he did. He went back to England, and once he became a priest, he returned to Ireland. Oh, by the way, his dad was a deacon, so he grew up in the church. Ultimately, he converted all Ireland, county by county. The first Christian royal chieftain made a gift to St. Patrick of a site for a church, which is still to this present day named Donat Patrick. He was ordained a bishop in 438. And it said during his lifetime, he established 300 churches, converted 100,000 Irish people, and consecrated 350 bishops. And St. Patrick had a major impact.
Was he a snake handler?
You know, I think that's all a myth. I don't know if there's any historical evidence that he drove any snakes out of Ireland. So he had two most famous writings were the Breastplate of St. Patrick and the Confession of St. Patrick, or Confessio. And of course, you know, back when I wrote this course and I thought we were going to be in person, I was going to hand out these things like I always do. So this is the St. Patrick's Breastplate. Any volunteers to read that one?
I'll do it. Christ ever with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ to my right side, Christ to my left side, Christ in his breadth, Christ in his length, Christ in depth, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of every man who speaks to me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Was that a hymn? Was that made into a hymn?
I think it's just a. You can still.
Yes, it's in the hymn. It's in the hymnal.
Is it really? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
It's the tune and the lyrics are both called St. Patrick's Breastplate.
The hymn is considerably longer than what you just read.
Mm-hmm. That's just the middle part.
This is a shortened version of it, actually.
One of the longest hymns we sing.
Yeah, we sang it at my ordination because it's so long.
Maybe that's where I recognize it from.
Probably.
Because I was there.
Yeah, that's the most recent time that we've sung it at St. Luke's that I know of. It's so long that it rarely gets used Sunday.
Yeah, that is the shortened version of the breastplate. And then as far as his confession of St. Patrick, there's this tradition that the heathen princesses were questions about God. Who is God? Where is he from? Oh, meeting's going to end in 10 minutes. It just got to pop up. And so in response to the questions, he wrote the confession. The confession of St. Patrick is extremely long. There's no way we would spend a whole half hour reading it, but I just took like the first paragraph to help you get a sense of it. So if anyone wants to read that.
Our God, God of all men, God of heaven and earth, seas and rivers, God of sun and moon, of all the stars, God of high mountain and lowly valleys, God over heaven and in heaven and under heaven. He who has a dwelling in heaven and earth and sea and in all things that are in them.
Oh, his second paragraph of it.
He inspires all things. He quickens all things. He is over all things. He supports all things. He makes the light of the sun to shine. He surrounds the moon and the stars. He has made wells in the arid earth, placed dry islands in the sea. He has a son co-eternal with himself, and the Holy Spirit breathes in them. Not separate are the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Okay. It's much longer than that, of course. All right. So let's talk about St. Bridget. St. Bridget was known as St. Bridget of Kildare from 451 to 525, so when she lived. Also known by all these many names, various spellings of Bridget, Brid, Bride, Naomi, Breed, or Mary of the Gales. There are many villages throughout the Celtic lands named after her. Kilbride means Church of Bridget. So anytime you see a Kilbride, it's really about her. She was an Irish nun, abbess, founder of several convents, held the rank of bishop, and soon after her death, generally venerated as a saint. This is where she was born, in the right there on the border between the two Irelands that exist today. This city called Foghart. Her first feast day is February 1st, and that's because she was born and died both on February 1st. And her father was Dubthach, a Leinster pagan chieftain, and her mother was a Pictish Christian. And so she was named after the Celtic goddess Bridget. That's why she's named Bridget, because her father named her after his favorite goddess of fire. She formed Kildare Abbey, which was one of her great accomplishments. So there are many stories about St. Bridget, many stories, and one of them about generosity, about her cross, about her cloak. So these stories go that she was very generous, and she never refused any beggar that would come to the door. And good thing her father was a wealthy chieftain, because she was always giving away milk and flour and other essential foods to people. And the legend is one day that she had no food to give them, so she gave her father's jeweled sword to a beggar. And she had been asking her father continuously for a long time that she wanted to go to a nunnery, to a convent, and refused. Apparently, shortly after she gave away his gold and jeweled sword, he finally relented and said, "You can go to the convent."
Get her out of the house.
You said she was a bishop?
Yes, she had the rank of a bishop, and some I've seen multiple sources saying that she was considered a bishop at the time, which again follows that theme that we've seen in the Celtic Christianity of the equality between men and women.
Yeah.
That the women could be priests and they could be bishops. Prior to Christianity, they were trained as druids. They were landowners. They were rulers. There was not this concept of men and women having unequal rights in the ancient Celtic lands. That thought hadn't come to them yet. And we can thank, Rome for bringing that kind of idea in. So another story is Bridget's cross, that she was, the legend goes, she was at the sickbed of a dying chieftain. May have been her father, may not have been. She was telling stories about Christianity to him, and she picked up some reeds and made this cross, and known as Bridget's cross. And still in those regions that celebrate her, you can still make Bridget's cross today. And the chieftain converted to Christianity on his deathbed. And so this Bridget's cross is a tradition since that time. Another legend about her is her cloak. Her father, she kept begging her father for some land to build a convent or a monastery. And he finally relented and said, I will give you as much land as your cloak will cover. And of course, in the miracle that happened, her cloak covered a huge, vast amount of land instead of just the amount a cloak would normally cover. And so here is how you make a Bridget's cross out of reeds, if you're so inclined to do so. There are many holy wells connected with Bridget, which again I see as prior to Christianity, wells were considered to be spiritual places, holy places, and I think I continued over into the Celtic Christianity when Christianity moved into the Celtic regions. There are 15 wells thought to be documented as connected to St. Bridget some way or another in Ireland. As I said, some of them have miraculous powers. You can dip your rag into them and put them on your eyes and cure eye ailments. Other miracles associated with the wells. So she died at the age of 75, on the same day she was born, February 1st. And she was placed in a jeweled casket and buried in a tomb at the high altar of the abbey of her church. But then when Norse invaders came along in the next century, 110 years later, she was exhumed and placed to rest at Downpatrick with St. Patrick and St. Columba. However, there's a
Wonder if they left the.
so there were
Wonder
some
if they.
there were some
Wonder if they used
that wanted.
the
I don't know why.
jewel casket when they reburied.
What's that?
They wonder if they used the jewel casket or they confiscated that and buried her in something else. That it's just a
Wow.
crazy question.
Right. So 3 knights, and I don't know why, but 3 knights decided they would take her head to Jerusalem. So her body was buried, transferred down with St. Patrick and St. Columba, but they were taking her head on to Jerusalem, but they didn't make it that far. They died along the way outside of Lisbon, Portugal. And so now you can, St. Bridget's head is currently in a chapel in Portugal. And her body is with St. Patrick. And she has other relics around the world too. She has a tunic that's in Belgium, and she has a jeweled shoe that's in a museum in Dublin. So her relics are scattered around.
Her head is not viewable, is it? I mean, it's just buried there, or do you know?
I don't know. I imagine it's probably encased in something. So across the Celtic lands, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, you'll see many places that are named after her. All these villages are either Gaelic versions of her name or English versions. I can't even pronounce most of these. In Scotland, many places are named after her. Landbride is supposed to be Pictish Gaelic for Church of Bridget. Even on the Isle of Man. Briche apparently is the Manx form of her name. All right. So, we have less than a minute to go. Our last saint of this series is Saint David. And I've written the next series of talks already, and it's going to be on pilgrimages. And I found a lot of interesting pilgrimages, and I'm going to start with a pilgrimage to St. David's Cathedral. So the things I learned